Hello everyone. So I'm going to wrap up the first half of the course before the midterm by talking about international trade. So just to give you an idea of where we're heading today, we're going to start out by talking about one of the earliest debates in modern economics, that is mercantilism versus free trade. Then I'm going to present a short, simple model of mutual gains from trade between nations. Then we're going to get a little bit closer to the real world by talking about some of the upsides and some of the downsides to international trade, globalization in general, and finally some of the specific trade policies that different countries engage in today. So, start out, let's talk about mercantilism. So, before Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the conventional wisdom was that of mercantilism. That is, that trade was merely a way for nations to turn economic power into political power. And so trade was almost seen as an extension of war. You did not want to be heavily intertwined with another nation, because if you were heavily intertwined with another nation, they could hurt you in the event of a war. And this was kind of the conventional wisdom of the day that everyone prescribed to. And this led to this body of protectionist policies that later came to be known as mercantilism. Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, made the controversial claim that international trade was beneficial to everyone involved. It wasn't a zero-sum game. And the idea here is that if two parties agree to a voluntary exchange, then they must each be getting something more valuable out of it than what they came in with, right? Like, you're not going to agree to trade $1 for a hamburger if that hamburger is worth less than $1 to you, right? And it's the same idea in international trade. And importantly, Smith thought about this as an extension of the division of labor and specialization among individuals in a society, but to the world. So the idea is that nations, not just individuals, could specialize and become more productive. The classic example here is Portugal producing wine and England producing wool. And sure, England could produce wine and Portugal could produce wool, but England is far more efficient at producing wool, and Portugal is far more efficient in producing wine, simply due to climate differences. And so the world gains in terms of consumption goods if each specializes in just producing one good. Smith's argument for this specialization among nations was built upon this idea of absolute advantage. And absolute advantage is simply the ability to produce something at a lower per unit cost than one's competitors. This idea was kind of the norm for trade theory for many, many years until David Ricardo came around with his idea of comparative advantage. And this was in the 1800s, but we still build trade theory upon this idea of comparative advantage. And comparative advantage is simply the ability to produce some goods or services at a lower opportunity cost than other producers. So, in our previous example, we could suppose that Portugal is just as efficient at producing both wine and wool, so they can produce everything at a higher absolute advantage. But if wine sells for more than wool, then their opportunity cost of producing wine is far less than England's opportunity cost of producing wine. And so they give up much less to produce wine. England would give up much more if they chose to produce wine. So it's not the absolute advantage in production, but the comparative advantage. We still gain through specialization, even if one trading partner has absolute advantage in production, because their resources are still going to be limited. Here's a simple model. So we've got two production possibility frontiers. We've assumed them to be straight lines for simplicity, but it would work just as well if they were the curved ones that you've seen up to this point. On the top here, we've got Portugal. Portugal can produce 100 bolts of cloth, or 200 cases of wine, or anywhere on the line between. But they would like to consume 100 units of each, which is beyond their production possibilities frontier. And as we saw in our previous model, if they try to do this alone, it's impossible. They cannot produce that much. They simply lack the resources necessary. The graph on the bottom shows the production possibilities frontier of Great Britain. Great Britain can also produce 200 cases of wine, but it can also produce 400 bolts of cloth. And, like Portugal, they wish to consume beyond their production possibilities frontier, 100 units of wine and 100 units of cloth. So, we can show very simply how, if these two groups trade, they can achieve higher consumption. So over here, I've drawn both production possibilities frontiers and the desired consumption levels on the same graph. Portugal in red, Great Britain in blue. And so if we assume complete specialization, Portugal can produce 200 cases of wine. And if we assume complete specialization in Great Britain, they can produce 400 bolts of cloth. We can see that if we add cloth consumed by Portugal plus cloth consumed by Great Britain, then that is going to be 300 plus 100 equals 400, which is the total amount of cloth produced if there's specialization. And on the wine side, we can see that we would have 100 plus 100 in consumption, which is equal to 200, which is the total number of cases of wine that would be produced if we had complete specialization of Portugal producing wine. So in this example, Great Britain would trade 300 cloth, and Portugal would trade 100 wine. And so that is the exchange that would be necessary for each country to produce, or each country to consume at this higher consumption level. Now, additionally, we might want to calculate what the opportunity cost is for each of these countries to produce each commodity. Because if we go back to our definition of comparative advantage, that's what's important, is their opportunity costs. So, let's calculate the opportunity cost of wine production in England. Cost in Great Britain to produce wine. So the way we calculate that is the highest amount of cloth that Great Britain could produce if they only produced cloth. And we divide that by the number of units of wine they could produce. And we can see that that is equal to 2. And we can make the same calculation for Portugal. So 100 units of cloth. So this is Portugal over 200 cases of wine. You can see it's 1/2. So we can see that the opportunity cost of producing wine in Portugal is lower than the opportunity cost of producing wine in Great Britain, which implies that Portugal should specialize in wine production. And if we were to calculate the opportunity costs of producing cloth, it would simply be the reciprocals. It would be units of wine per units of cloth. And we would see there that we would have a lower opportunity cost of producing cloth in Great Britain, and thus Great Britain should specialize in producing cloth, leading to the pattern of specialization that we supposed at the beginning of this example. We keep using this example of wine and cloth or wool, but this is not what economists are generally talking about today. These were just kind of examples that were used in the old political economy days. But what are we actually concerned about? Usually, we're talking about labor-intensive production or labor-intensive goods and capital-intensive goods. So, goods which are labor-intensive tend to be produced in the developing world, while capital-intensive goods tend to be produced in the developed world. We've talked a bit about trade, about mutual gains for trade, but we should talk about some of its consequences. One theory is factor price equalization. And so this idea is just that trade between nations if we eliminate trade barriers between nations, should eliminate differences in prices between those nations over time. And this may take an extremely long time, or may not ever bear out if trade barriers continue to exist, or different cultural or structural differences in those countries. One particularly problematic price in this factor price equalization idea is wages. Wages are a particularly slow-moving type of price. They're sticky. And we can see examples of this working, of wages adjusting over time, and examples of it not. For instance, Bangladesh, which produces a lot of kind of labor-intensive goods, wages are still much lower there, despite the fact trade has gone on between them and the developed world for many, many years. And we still see, for example, a more successful case of factor price equalization in terms of labor of China, where wages have increased, but is still far short of the average wage rates in the developed world, or the more developed world. This also has a consequence in the affluent countries. So, for instance, if wages don't adjust downward, because if factor prices are equalizing, it's not just that the low-wage countries are going to start paying higher wages, it's just the high-wage countries should also be paying lower wages as this equates. But workers in the affluent countries are very unwilling to accept falls in their wage rate. So because of that, the wage rate may remain high, and the adjustment will instead occur through employment, or reductions of employment. And so this is what we can see in the U.S. of perhaps one way of explaining the fall in manufacturing sector employment, is those wages remained high, but the number of jobs fell. Because sticky wages didn't allow adjustment to market equilibrium. So there are a large number of very important benefits that we get from trade. As put forward in our simple model, it allows a nation to consume beyond its production possibilities frontier. It lets more possible bundles of consumption goods be purchased. It also can lead to more responsive production decision-making. If we've got international markets where there's a going price, if, say, there's an oil shortage in one place, then the price of oil there will increase, which will draw oil to it, and it allows the economy to be somewhat dynamic, especially when it comes to undifferentiated commodities. Going back to Smith, it also increases the extent of the market. And so if the extent of the market becomes very, very large, then we can support more specialized production. An example I like here is, for instance, in a small town, you are not going to see a lot of the specialist shops that you see in a large city, because there simply isn't enough critical mass of market size to support people that deal not just, say, in cloth, but specifically in trims or buttons or what have you, right? So you can get a finer division of labor and people become more specialized and more efficient in production when the scale of the market is larger. Another classic argument for the benefits of trade is that it helps promote international peace. So kind of the biggest fear of the mercantilists here, if two nations are very economically intertwined, then it becomes much more costly for them to get into open political conflict with one another. This is very kind of prominent in our current time with talk of, say, trade war with China. This is going to be immensely costly for both countries. And trade kind of makes those costs higher, which makes getting along a preferable option often. And finally, it is undeniable that development has followed free trade, especially when it's well managed, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But the economic development in China has raised more people out of poverty than almost any other single instance of economic development in the last 100 years. It has been immensely important, and that is in large part due to China opening up to a greater degree to international trade. But there are some downsides to trade that we should also keep in mind. There's an issue of vulnerability and lock-in, particularly for nations that are very dependent upon production of a single good, service, or resource. The classic example here is the resource curse, right? Where if a country is, say, dependent entirely on oil production, their whole economy is beholden to the oil market. And so if oil prices go down, their economy suffers. If they go up, they do well. And if that country doesn't use the profits from their oil business to invest in other industries over time, they can become locked in. And this is where the resource curse comes from, where a country that is endowed with a lot of natural resources is able to extract those, but if they don't invest in other types of production, they can be made worse off when it's all said and done, and the resource is depleted. Another issue here is power differentials. Large developed countries are large buyers and sellers of things. And just like in a national economy where a large firm can have a lot of market power and dictate the terms of deals it makes with other firms, so too can this happen in the international sphere among nations. And a lot of these power differentials play out in international institutions like the World Trade Organization. And there's a long-standing conflict in that organization between the more affluent countries and the developing countries, because the developing countries feel as though a lot of the policies that are put forward through the WTO benefit the already developed affluent countries. This has gotten somewhat better in recent times, and we'll talk about that in more detail when we get to trade agreements. Environmental impacts is also a possible downside to trade. Transportation costs, in terms of environmental costs, are astronomical. Large container ships, they can emit as much CO2 as some cities. It is staggering. International trade can also help obfuscate a lot of the environmental impacts that are happening because of actions of people in the affluent nations, but those impacts get exported to the less affluent nations. An example here is, for a while in the US, a huge amount of our recycling went to China. But a lot of the industrial activity to recycle is very low margin, or ultimately not that profitable. And so in China, a lot of this work was done by the most impoverished groups of people who could find no other sort of labor. And finally, China said, we're not going to accept your waste anymore because we can't even profitably deal with it here. And so in that way, in a very explicit way, the environmental impacts of consumption in the affluent world was exported to China. Another, and that's a very kind of stark example, but a more subtle example is just simply when goods are produced elsewhere, the pollution that results from their production happens there rather than wherever the final good is consumed. And so these are all different ways that trade kind of obfuscates and intensifies the environmental impacts of economic activity. There are also inequality and social impacts that can result from trade. Whenever trade is liberalized, tariffs are lowered, quotas are raised, regulations that limit trade are obliterated. There are winners and losers who are created. Sure, the economic theory tells us that efficiency is increased in economic terms, but there are winners and losers. And what so happens is that the people that lose in the affluent nations lose over and over again when trade is liberalized. In the US, that has been low and middle income blue-collar workers, because their jobs have been destroyed. And sure, consumers are enjoying the benefit of reduced prices, but this same group keeps getting hit on the income side. And this has massive inequality implications in the developed world. But it's important not to focus just on the developed world, but to think about where those jobs are going as well. And whenever production moves to these developing nations, that generates incomes there and has generally helped development. And so on one hand, it's making inequality worse in the affluent countries, but it's making it better in a global terms by raising people up at the very bottom end of the global income distribution. There are also diminishing returns to trade liberalization. So, as was mentioned in your textbook, the economist Danny Roderick made an estimation that in the U.S., because trade barriers are already so low, that average tariffs are already below about 5%. So a move to go to completely free trade in the U.S. would reshuffle more than $50 of income among different groups for each dollar of efficiency gain. So that's a massive redistribution relative to the total efficiency gain. There are also issues with race to the bottom, so the so-called race to the bottom. And essentially, this is related to the mobility of capital and labor being different. Capital, money, investment funds, is essentially free to move across international borders without limit. Meanwhile, labor is heavily tied to the nation in which the worker lives, and we actively limit the movement of workers between countries. And so money can simply flee to whatever country will generate the highest rate of return, but labor is stuck. And so countries, particularly in the developing world, kind of have to compete on relatively eroded labor standards, because upholding labor standards is costly for employers. And if a country can eliminate different labor standards, then that can make their workers relatively cheaper to employ for international firms, and they can draw jobs to them. But this creates an issue where you have nations competing each other to undercut each other in terms of regulatory costs to gain jobs from these multinational corporations. And so in this way, we can also think about this as a way that the power of multinational corporations can undermine even democratic government, because they've got an immense bargaining power. And so these are all just downsides that should be thought of when we're kind of dangling the efficiency gains of trade in front of us. We should also think about these downsides. Changing gears for just a bit to just talk about globalization. Globalization just has this broad definition of the extension of free trade and communications across the entire world, and so on. This graph that I've got here is showing the percentage of world output traded internationally over time, and we can see that from the period of 1960 to 2015, it has more than doubled. So a far, far greater percentage of world GDP is being traded. There's also a great deal of variation among nations. Here we've got the blue bars representing exports, the black bars representing imports, and you can see what percentage of that country's GDP is traded. And we can see in Vietnam here, almost 90% of their GDP is their imports and exports each make up about 90% of GDP. It's important to note here that exports count towards GDP and imports count against it, because we count net exports as a positive term in GDP. But over on the right-hand side, we see the US and Nigeria actually have a relatively, compared to these other countries, a relatively small proportion of their GDP wrapped up in trade, for very different reasons. And so there are a number of different ways that nations can respond to globalization. And one is the use of protectionism, which is, seems to be a move that many in the developed world are taking as of late. And these are just simply uses of government policies to restrict trade with other countries and protect domestic industries from foreign competition. This is a very different strategy than import substitution, which is another development strategy. And this is a policy undertaken by governments seeking to reduce reliance on imports and encourage domestic industry. And so they increase the level of trade openness with respect to exports to try to increase net exports, to draw more money into the country to further capital investment to help development. An extension of this import substitution and protectionist strategy that kind of combines both is the infant industry argument. And so infant industry is an industry that's relatively new to a country, and it can be protected from international competition by tariffs, other barriers of trade, until it is more prepared to compete on the world market. The most classic and successful example here is the Japanese auto industry. After World War II, the Japanese auto industry was able to kind of become very, very good at producing cars with this kind of captive Japanese market that was highly protected. And so when the 1970s come around, they are really well positioned to compete in the global market, and they largely outcompeted American automakers. But much more broadly, these infant industry approaches have historically been what developed nations did in the past to become developed. The US was a very protectionist country until its industries were well developed. Same with the UK. And so this leads to an economist named Ha-Joon Chang's argument of kicking away the ladder, which states that the developed world used these infant industry protectionism to develop their own industrial capacity, and then they took that option away from the developing nations in the present day in order to kind of be able to trap them at a stage where they could simply have their resources extracted. So some other trade policies that are kind of more nuts and bolts are tariffs, which are just taxes on imported goods charged by national governments, quotas, which are just caps on the amount of a particular good or service that can be imported. There are also trade-related subsidies where you just give payments to producers to encourage more production, either for export or to substitute for import. So this would be, for instance, giving tax credits to auto manufacturers in the U.S. to help those auto companies provide their cars at a lower cost, so that domestic consumers won't purchase foreign cars, for instance. And finally, there are administrative obstacles. So these are the use of different regulations like environment, health, safety to prevent imports from other countries under the pretext of upholding some consumer welfare standard or consumer protection standard. And this is kind of ambiguous because it's difficult to say when a country is doing this in the interests of protecting people versus the interests of giving their domestic industry a great benefit. A major example here is the EU kept out agricultural imports from the developing world for a long time under the pretext of regulatory standards. And they were eventually forced to accept greater imports of agricultural goods by the World Trade Organization. It's also important to note that there may be good reasons for these sort of administrative obstacles. A classic example here in the US that the WTO eventually allowed was the preventing of importing into the US of tuna that was caught in nets that were not sea turtle safe. A more stark example here is the ability of a nation to prevent the importation of goods that were produced with child or slave labor. And so these are administrative obstacles that may be more justified than the EU's, say, regulatory standard around agricultural goods. How is this whole kind of web of international trade managed? There's one large international organization that is certainly the most powerful institution in this realm, and it's the World Trade Organization. And so the World Trade Organization kind of acts as both a legislative and judiciary body of all countries which are members, which is the vast majority of nations across the world, that creates rules to govern trade. And very importantly, it works under a system called multilateralism, and that is that individual parties within the World Trade Organization cannot make side deals with one another within the WTO. All nations must be treated the same in the entire organization. So the US and the UK can't make a deal in the WTO that gives them special privileges. If they make a deal with one nation, they have to make a deal with all nations, and this is the so-called most favored nation status. The WTO also has a judiciary process, where if one country feels that another has violated the terms of the WTO agreements, they can be brought into an international court where retaliatory tariffs can be brought in place in form of punishment or fines. A very prominent example of this is that Brazil actually brought the U.S. before the WTO court over its subsidization of cotton growers in the U.S. And Brazil actually won that case, and the U.S. was forced to pay a fine every year that they continue the practice. But in a great example of differential power between the affluent and less affluent nations, the U.S. simply continues to pay the fine year after year, even though they lost the case, because they can afford to. A issue that has come up in these judiciary processes too is that less affluent nations are less able to receive competent legal aid. And in response to that, in recent decades, the WTO has hired a number of very prominent trade lawyers to work pro bono for these countries. They have an office in Geneva where they can seek representation. So the WTO is kind of like the biggest institution of international trade. But other than that, there are other regional or bilateral trade agreements, the EU being the largest one, right? It's this giant trading bloc that has broken down almost all barriers to trade within that trading bloc. But there are also smaller bilateral agreements and side agreements too among multiple nations. These often run afoul of the WTO rules, but they're kind of begrudgingly tolerated. We can think of these regional trade agreements as either a form of trade liberalization, of making trade between these kind of specific nations easier, or as a diversion from free trade. For instance, we could think of maybe the doubling down on the EU trading bloc as a way of kind of providing preferential treatment to the countries within Europe while excluding everyone outside of it. Wrapping up things that we should be thinking about here. Expanding trade improves economic efficiency and allows countries to consume beyond their production possibilities frontier, but it may not promote overall well-being. We need to think of the downsides as well. Development has undeniably followed a managed free trade, but the WTO is kind of reluctant to make some exceptions. Some exceptions that they have allowed, for instance, are limits on free trade as a result of genetically modified organisms. The EU still has been able to successfully keep that as something that they can discriminate against in international markets through the WTO process. So-called dumping, selling of goods below their production costs in a nation to simply get rid of them and obliterate the domestic competition there. That is not allowed under WTO rules. And finally, the WTO is slowly starting to allow countries a greater ability to discriminate among goods based on the labor standards used to produce them. But this list of exceptions is kind of ad hoc. There's no clear guiding principle or rule that says this is okay and this isn't. So, as somebody thinking about trade policy, you should think about what is fair and think a little more broadly than just pure economic efficiency, though that is certainly important. So, just wrapping things up, trade can be mutually beneficial. As I've talked about multiple times here, comparative advantage determines the pattern of international specialization. There are upsides and downsides, and we need to measure them against each other. Globalization has come with a massive increase in the volume of trade in recent decades, and international trade is governed by these large international agreements like the WTO, and this patchwork of regional agreements that sometimes conflict with the WTO. And this whole process is kind of the policy field in which the affluent nations and the developing nations kind of have to negotiate with one another to figure out what is agreeable or what is fair. All right, I think that's all I've got for this week. Thanks.